The Eastern Front of the Second World War was the stage of not only the most ferocious fighting, but also its most savage atrocities. The reason for these crimes wasn't solely the result of hatred towards the Soviets, but also of an insidious plan to colonize Eastern Europe. The origins of Generalplan Ost can be traced back to the German Empire. Far-right pan-Germanists had perhaps envisioned the future where Germany governed over millions of serfs. The pan-German leader, Heinrich Class, even contemplated the extermination of native populations. After the end of the Second World War, it was revealed in the German archives that political, military, and business circles considered the fragmentation of Tsarist Russia as an excellent opportunity to take hold of her resources so that the Reich could rival both Britain and France. These plans were put on full display after the Germans imposed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk upon Bolshevik Russia. The belief that the lands of Eastern Europe rightfully belonged to the Germans was from a myth that claimed that Slavic and Baltic people had illegitimately occupied them after the fall of the Roman Empire. The Nazis merely appropriated already existing ideas that they inherited from the German Empire. In Mein Kampf, Hitler clearly states his intentions on creating living space in Eastern Europe. When describing his vision for the East, he says, quote, "We, National Socialists, have deliberately drawn a line under our pre-war foreign policy. We stand where we were 600 years ago. We are stopping the Germanic migration to the south and the west of Europe and redirecting it to the east. We have concluded with the territorial policy of the future. It appears that destiny itself has guided us towards this direction." When fate abandoned Russia to Bolshevism, the Russian people were stripped of their cultured classes necessary to build and maintain the existence of the state. The Germanic element can be considered banished from Russia. The Jew has taken its place. For the Russian, it's impossible to shake off the Jewish yoke with their own strength, as it is for the Jew to continue dominating that vast empire for much longer. The immense empire will collapse with a crash on the best day. Even after signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Hitler's policy towards the East never changed. Aside from Mein Kampf, the German population were further exposed to these plans via state propaganda, depicting the colonization of conquered territory. Between 1940 and 1941, the Nazis had gotten a lot more serious in their Eastern policy in preparation for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. High-ranking Nazi officials such as Alfred Rosenberg, Heinrich Himmler, and, of course, Hitler himself were either directly or indirectly involved in the creation of Generalplan Ost. There were 4 different steps of the planning, each taken by a different state institution. The Reich Commissioner for the Consolidation of German Nationhood elaborated the planning basis for the construction of the Eastern Territories in 1940, which was targeted at the ethnic reconstruction of Western Poland. The Reich Security Main Office developed the Generalplan Ost in November 1941, focusing on racial selection and deportations. The RFK then refined the aforementioned Generalplan Ost in May 1942. They also developed the General Settlement Plan between 1942 and 1943, which added further proposals for Germanization of Western and Southeastern Europe. The Reich Ministry for the Occupied Eastern Territories and the SS were also involved in its planning. It is important to note that a lot of the original documentation regarding Generalplan Ost was destroyed by the Germans before the end of the war. Historians have been forced to piece together the plan by studying various documents and testimonies that reference it. One of these sources is a collection of 3 documents written by Dr. Erhard Wetzel. They have been digitally archived along with a post-war study of the plan. I have also created an English translation of this document for the research of this video. It is not perfect, but at least it is understandable. This is the source I'll be using throughout most of the video, unless I specifically reference another one. To summarize the document, it details the plans for the deportation, enslavement, and extermination of Poles and Soviet citizens, as well as the colonization and exploitation of Eastern Europe. The Germans estimated that the population of the areas that were to be colonized sat at around 45 million people. However, it appears that this estimate doesn't include the 5 to 6 million Jews that lived in the area, meaning that the number should sit around 50 to 51 million. Even then, Hetzel argues that this estimate is also inaccurate, claiming that the true figure is around 60 to 65 million. Whatever the case, only 14 million of these people would be allowed to stay in the colonized areas. So between 31 million at its lowest to 51 million at its highest would have to be resettled. The fate of the Jews is outright stated that they will eventually be eliminated. The elimination of Soviet Jews commenced before the gas chambers were even constructed. During their advance, the Germans committed a series of massacres against the Jewish population, most infamously in Babi Yar, close to Kiev, where 33,000 people, including women and children, were executed by German police. As for the remainder of the so-called undesirables, they were to be resettled. Before we continue, it's important to note that the Nazis often use innuendos to hide their true intentions. We've all heard words like deportation, liquidation, resettlement, final solution, Germanization, and so on and so forth. We know for a fact that the murder of Soviet citizens was considered and even put in place. Before the invasion, the Germans developed what they called the hunger strategy. It was designed to systematically rob civilians of their food to feed the Wehrmacht during their advance. This is the reason why German planners believed that 30 million Soviet citizens would die during the invasion. Millions of people, most notably in the cities and Red Army POWs, would die of starvation during the winter of 1941 and the years to come. Deportation and resettlement can be used in its most literal sense as well as a stand-in for extermination. For those who remained under Nazi rule, they were to be Germanized. But that doesn't mean they would be treated as equals. It is well documented that the Nazis enslaved millions of people from the occupied territories to fuel their war effort. If the remainder of the native population were to be truly Germanized, then the Nazis would essentially be eliminating a pool of cheap labor. Thus, Germanization has a double meaning: integration into broader German society, or enslavement. Another way to eliminate non-Germans in the colonized area was to reduce the birth rate. According to German sources, the birth rate in the USSR was much higher than in Germany, particularly in Ukraine and in White Ruthenia, i.e. Belarus. Contraceptives for non-Germans were to be made readily available and their use promoted by propaganda. Abortion was also to be made readily accessible. Interestingly, Hetzel notes that the birth rate had gone down as the USSR industrialized. Based off of this, we can assume that some level of industrialization could possibly be maintained in some of these areas. While it isn't stated in Hetzel's letter, another option to control the birth rate would be the sterilization of Soviet citizens. This was done within Germany itself against the genetically and sociably undesirable. Before the war had even started, about 360,000 of their own citizens had been sterilized. If the Nazis failed to reduce the birth rate, it is possible that they would have implemented these measures. In regards to deportation, Hetzel believed it necessary to incentivize people to resettle more or less voluntarily. The prospects of better opportunities outside of the colonized area could be incentivized via the creation of jobs in factories and in administration. To facilitate the deportation of all the undesirables and the colonization by German settlers, an extensive rail network would have to be constructed. While this is speculation on my behalf, the deterioration of the standard of living under German rule could also be used to force out the racially undesirable. If voluntary deportations could not be achieved in the desired numbers, then it is likely that they would be done so by force. You can imagine how that would have looked. Crammed cattle cars filled with civilians, traveling for days if not weeks under the care of people who consider them as inferior. It is likely that many would die before even reaching their destination. Depending on where they were from, the prospects of the native population being either deported or Germanized could vary. First, we will start with the Baltic states. The Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians were by far the most preferred by the Germans, especially if they lived in coastal cities that had historically been under German influence. Hetzel even believed that a precise racial examination of the Estonian population could lead to most of them being Germanized. The exact percentage of Baltic peoples that should be Germanized and deported was not yet clear, and further examinations would be necessary. Hetzel believed that it would be far easier to work with these people than working with the Russians. For those of them who ended up in Siberia, they could take up positions in administration under German supervision. Hetzel believed that by offering the Baltic peoples appropriate acquisitions of land in the east and the like, then the danger of them returning to their homeland can be eliminated. The Poles were considered by far to be the most dangerous and the most anti-German of them all. Before Generalplan Ost had even been created, the Germans began colonizing parts of western Poland with ethnic Germans, predominantly refugees from the Baltic. Thousands of Poles and Jews were deported to the general government. The Polish elite, i.e. military officers, priests, intellectuals, politicians, etc., were systematically murdered and incarcerated in an attempt to completely erase the concept of Poland itself. The Poles, unlike the Jews, could not simply be liquidated. According to Generalplan Ost, 80% to 85% were to be deported to Siberia. Emigration from Europe to places such as Brazil was also an option. While they weren't considered as undesirable as other races, only between 2 and 5% were considered fit for Germanization. Before continuing, it's important to define the Nazis' vision of Siberia. Generalplan Ost heavily implies that the vast Russian East would be controlled by some sort of puppet state partially occupied and administrated by German forces. The Nazis had much more grandiose plans than to just use it as a simple dumping ground. They intended to foment the creation of a distinct Siberian identity to combat what they called Russianness. The Poles would most likely be the largest group of deportees in the area. The large number of Poles in Siberia would most likely turn the region into a hotbed of revolt against German authority. From here, there are two possible scenarios. The first is that the Poles would integrate into a broader Siberian identity. The second is that the Siberians themselves would become Polish, resulting in the creation of a new Polish state, or a Greater Poland. Regardless of what were to happen, it was acceptable as long as the Poles and the Siberians stayed out of the arms of the Russians. As for the next-door neighbors of the Poles, the Ukrainians, they were slightly less hated than the first. The Nazis believed that Western Ukrainians were superior to their Eastern brothers due to them supposedly having Nordic blood. 35% of them were to be Germanized, though this is only an assumption and it remained to be seen what further studies would conclude. Regardless of this slightly more favorable view, their fate under Nazi rule would have been that of uneducated agricultural workers. Cities such as Kiev were to be destroyed, but due to the Wehrmacht needing a bridgehead over the Dnieper River, Kiev would remain intact, at least for a while. Instead, Kiev's population, along with those of other Soviet cities such as Kharkiv, were to starve to death in accordance to the hunger strategy. 65% of Western Ukrainians were to be deported. The RSHA was of the opinion that they should be dumped in Siberia. However, Wetzel argues that this would be politically undesirable. Firstly, they would run the risk of pushing the Ukrainians into the arms of the Russians, and secondly, would alienate them from the Germans. He believed that instead of Siberia, they should just be deported to the eastern part of the country, which would become the Reichskommissariat Ukraine. This proposal was still imperfect as it would create tensions between them and the Germans. Hetzel believes that they should be convinced that the best chances for national and economic development were in the hands of the Germans. The fertile lands of the steppe and the industries of the Donbass could provide for the Ukrainian population. Whatever the case, the Nazis' ultimate goal was to use the Ukrainians and other native populations to weaken the Russians. The question of what to do with White Ruthenia, i.e. Belarus, was not entirely answered. The land which the Belarusians inhabited was barren, thus not suited for agriculture, though their forests were still of value. 75% of them were to be deported, and 25% were to be Germanized. Just like with the Ukrainians, part of the Belarusian population supposedly had Nordic blood. These lucky few were to be Germanized as soon as possible before they could develop a distinct White Ruthenian identity. They could be employed as farmers, craftsmen, and in industry. The destination for the deportees was not yet determined. Siberia was, of course, considered but presented the same problems as with the deportation of the Western Ukrainians. The North Caucasus and even the Reichskommissariat Ukraine were also an option. They would either become Siberian, Caucasian, or Ukrainian. As long as their absorption by the Russians was prevented, any of these solutions was acceptable. If you couldn't tell, one of the main objectives of Generalplan Ost was the complete pacification of Russia. The industrialization of the Soviet Union, in the eyes of the Nazis, demonstrated that they were capable of great achievements. The sheer mass of the Russian population was also of great concern. To eliminate the threat of Russianness, the Russian national identity itself was to be destroyed. The conquered Russian territory was to be divided up into as many commissariats as possible. The reason for this was to further the destruction of Russia by separating its people in the hopes of developing separate regional identities. To quote Hetzel, "The Russian from the General Commissariat Gorky must be given the feeling of being something different from the Russian from the General Commissariat of Tula." This is basically what they wanted to do with the creation of a distinct Siberian identity, just on a smaller scale. The de-Russification of ethnic minorities and the repopulation of land with non-Russians, such as Turks and Finns, would also further this goal. Pitting the Russians against as many different groups, such as the Poles, Ukrainians, Siberians, etc., would prevent the Russians from creating a united front against the Germans and keeping them bogged down in endless war. The Nazis had little interest in Germanizing most of the Russians. The only consideration was given to the Russians from the northwest that the Nazis considered to have Nordic blood. They were to be deported away from the rest of the Russian population if they were to be Germanized. The total number of Russians that were to be deported and exterminated is not stated in Hetzel's documents, but that doesn't mean that it wouldn't occur. The aforementioned hunger strategy claimed the lives of millions. The continued application of it and other methods would continue to thin out the Russian population. Their deaths would serve the Nazis well. It is also stated that the complete annihilation of the Russians is only desirable if The Germans are incapable of filling their space with their own people. To quote Hetzel again, "For us Germans, the only thing that matters is to weaken Russianness to such an extent that it is no longer in a position to endanger Germany's claim to leadership in the European area." The Caucasus and its inhabitants are only mentioned a few times in Hetzel's documents, usually in a negative light. Hetzel discusses deporting what he calls Mongols and other so-called undesirables to the region. An important thing to note about this region is its vast deposits of oil. Germany suffered from chronic shortages of fuel and other resources. As seen with their 1942 offensive towards Stalingrad, the capture of the Caucasus oil fields was of the utmost importance. A large German military presence in the area is to be expected had they succeeded. On the Czech question, the Nazis planned to have 50% of them Germanized. The rest would be deported to Siberia, where their national identity would be dissolved into Siberianism. While not considered as violent as their Polish equivalent, the Czech intelligentsia was noted as possessing a fanatical hatred towards the Germans. Immigration overseas was proposed to deal with them, but just like in Poland, they were also subject to murder and incarceration. Due to the invasion of Yugoslavia not having been anticipated, the Nazis' plans for this region were not very developed. Hetzel's documents have no mention of Yugoslavia, but other iterations of Generalplan Ost do. The Nazis immediately began incarcerating and killing Yugoslavia's Jewish population with the help of local allies. Most of the area was occupied by a joint Axis force, with a Croatian puppet state being established in the middle. Only a small chunk of Slovenia was formally annexed into the Third Reich. This area would most likely be colonized. Once the native populations of the USSR had been dealt with, the Nazis could finally achieve their ultimate goal: the colonization of the East. The corrupt Soviet cities such as Kiev and Leningrad would be destroyed to make way for agrarian settlements. The traditional rural lifestyle was heavily romanticized by the Nazis, portraying it as healthier than living in the cities. The ideal colonist would be both a farmer and a soldier, working the land as well as defending it. The natives that were then Germanized would be used for manual labor. German settlements were to be constructed primarily in Lithuania, Latvia, southern Leningrad, and in central and southern Ukraine. There was also a possibility that large forest estates would be constructed within Belarus after certain conditions were met. Immigration to the east should ideally be voluntary. To do this, the land should be made as easy to acquire as possible, more or less free of charge. Before the outbreak of the war, Germany was suffering from a land shortage. It believed that by conquering the East, it would help alleviate this issue. The hereditary farm law would also help push for colonization. For context, one of the things that this law did was prevent German farmers from dividing up their land amongst their sons, instead giving it to the most productive. These landless farmers would then be incentivized to settle land in the East as long as they were racially desirable. It was hoped that a few 100,000 settlers would eventually turn into millions over the course of several decades. The examples of the USA, Canada, and Australia are pointed out as evidence for this. Despite their optimism, the Nazis realized that relying solely on settlers from Germany for colonization wouldn't be enough. This is why there was constant talk about Germanizing racially desirable people from the occupied territories. The Nazis believed that there were 87 million Germans living in Europe. Germans from independent states such as Hungary could be given the opportunity to migrate east. The question of whether the Germans from places like Ukraine and Crimea would continue living there was yet to be determined. Those from other Soviet regions, such as the Volga, would most likely be resettled. It was expected that in 30 years, there would be at least 10 million Germans settled in the east. The possibility of this occurring was unlikely. Hetzel's own estimate is that only 8 million would be achieved. At the end of Hetzel's second document, he discusses the plans regarding the relations between Germans with foreigners and mixed-race Germans. It's the typical stuff we've all heard before. Race mixing is bad, and the mongrels, as Hetzel calls them, possess a serious threat to the Aryan race. Those whom are citizens of other nations will be the easiest to deal with, as they can simply leave. The rest of the so-called aliens living in Germany were to be deported as far away as possible. As for the Germans of mixed race, there were two possible outcomes. Most would probably just be deported without a second thought. But depending on if they had been brought up entirely in the German sphere of perception and culture, it may be beneficial for the Nazis to keep them around. As we can expect, Germany would be facing a manpower shortage after the war. Employing mixed-race Germans as administrators in the occupied territories, such as Turkestan and Armenia, would be a much more productive way to utilize these people rather than forcing them to emigrate. To stop the influx of unwanted races into the Reich after the war, preventative measures would have to be taken. One such measure would be to create universities in areas that were not meant for colonization, for example, in the Caucasus. This is speculation of mine, but I feel like the Nazis would have used much more draconian measures to keep them out. In an ironic twist of fate, it was the Germans who got Generalplan Osted by the very people they sought to exterminate and enslave. Generalplan Ost was first and foremost the result of ideology. While the conquest of the East had practical reasons, such as requiring resources, the main driving force behind it were the delusions of a psychopath. To put it lightly, it was absolute insanity. The plan obviously lacked refinement. While it could have been improved and fleshed out, the overall results are unlikely to significantly change. The complete realization of Hitler's plans for the East was very likely to fail. The plan to divide and conquer the Soviet Union was itself deeply flawed. To completely eliminate the threat of the Russians by pitting various groups against them only could have worked if they were viewed as the greater evil. But that could have only happened if the Germans weren't as ruthless as they were. As we saw during the war, millions of people in the Soviet Union hoped that the German invasion would liberate them from Stalin. But once they became aware of the Nazis' genocidal plans, those hopes quickly evaporated. Even in places like Ukraine, where Stalin had killed millions of them during the Holodomor, most of the population fought against the Germans. While the Nazis managed to enlist a few 100,000 of them, it dealt in comparison to the millions that served in the Red Army. Belarusians, Ukrainians, Georgians, Kazakhs, and even the Poles, for Christ's sake, were much more willing to fight alongside the Russians than they were with the Germans. The only exception to this would be the Baltic states that had just recently lost their independence to Stalin. But once they realized that the Nazis weren't going to give it to them back, their opinions towards the Germans would certainly change. The preparations taken for the planned settlement of the area also didn't work. The hunger strategy wasn't nearly as successful as the Nazis had hoped. The elimination of the native population in the colonized territories would have to be done with ulterior methods. Millions of people would have to be deported. Alternatively, they could just be executed. Whatever the case, the Nazis would have to dedicate significant resources to this task, all the while the locals continued to resist them. Once they were properly organized, Soviet partisans, especially in Belarus, were quite effective against the Germans and would have to be eliminated before any Germans could settle in the area. While it isn't impossible to eliminate all these people, it would have been much more difficult than expected. Probably one of the most far-fetched ideas was that they could create artificial regional identities in Russia. As mentioned, this would be done via the massive deportations and redrawing of borders. As far as I'm aware, nothing like this has ever been tried to the extent that the Nazis planned. The closest thing that I can think of is the Russification that occurred during the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, which attempted to dissolve minorities into the broader Russian identity. While it certainly left a mark that is still visible to this day, it failed to completely change the identities of large groups such as the Belarusians, Ukrainians, Estonians, etc. To destroy a nation, you would have to destroy its memory, and I am most certain that the memory of the trauma inflicted upon these peoples by the Germans would never be forgotten. The very objective of the conquest of the Soviet Union, the creation of living space, was completely absurd. The previously discussed documents made it very clear that Germany could barely settle the area. Even the very idea of colonization was ridiculous. First of all, the land shortages that the Germans faced in the Reich could have easily been solved with technological advancements. Even then, the amount of land that they wanted to conquer was much more than what they needed. Second, the very concept of establishing agrarian settlements in the East was completely unnecessary. Since the start of the Industrial Revolution, peasants had begun to leave the countryside in search of new opportunities in the cities. The planners of Generalplan Ost should have been able to predict this from a mile away. The ideal vision of the rural lifestyle that the Nazis had just doesn't have a place in modern society. Luckily for us, Generalplan Ost was never fully implemented. The closest the Nazis got to colonize the East were a few experimental settlements in Poland, but they still attempted to lay down the groundwork for it by deporting, enslaving, and killing millions of people. That is all for today. If you want to support the channel, you can consider subscribing. I know it sounds kind of weird to ask for this type of stuff at the end of what we just talked about, but anyways, if you want to support me with ulterior methods, you can donate to my Ko-fi page. That'd be very appreciated. Anyways, thanks for watching, and I hope you all take care. Goodbye.
I've been using my intuitive alchemical symbolism when I was stoned as a way to fight the left. So I captured the left circle in my triangle, which is symbolic for the right and the left hemisphere. The left hemisphere has to serve the right hemisphere.